Warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today. My name is Robert Harrison, and I'm the director of Another Look Book Club, which was founded by my friend and colleague Tobias Wolff some 8 years ago. And Tobias and I are looking forward to the next hour and a half. It gives us an occasion to think and talk about something other than the raging wildfires out west here, or the raging politics of this troubled republic of ours. And of course, the pandemic that has thrown all of us for a loss over the past several months. Most of our members know that Stanford is facing some financial challenges and that Another Look has lost its funding for the moment from continuing studies. We're hoping that we can find a way to keep it going. And if we do, it will be in large part because of the many letters, eloquent and heartfelt letters that so many of you sent to continuing studies in support of Another Look. Our administrator, Cynthia Haven, Tobias Wolff, and I thank you kindly for that show of support and for making your voices heard. It made a big difference. And let me mention that among those who reached out to us with an offer of help was Stanford's Distinguished Careers Institute, or DCI. And today's session, in fact, is made possible by the generous contribution of DCI. And hopefully our collaboration will continue in the future. So before we start discussing Henry James and the Aspern Papers, I would like to invite Donna Slade, who is a representative of DCI here today, to say a few words to us.
Thank you, Robert. I'm Donna Slade. I'm a 2017 fellow from DCI. And when I got the email that basically said Another Look Book Club is being defunded, I thought maybe DCI could do something about that. And graciously, they did. And if you could bear with me for a moment, I'd just like to read for everyone a little bit about what DCI is. It'll take a moment. The Distinguished Careers Institute at Stanford University believes higher education can play a role for those who have already had successful careers and who are looking for a new direction. DCI offers the opportunity for highly accomplished individuals from all walks of life who are eager to transform themselves for roles with social impact at the local, national, and global levels. DCI provides fellows with customized curricula and access to a wealth of resources at Stanford and in Silicon Valley, and supports them on their journey to a new purpose and wellness. DCI also seeks to foster intergenerational engagement in an academic setting and to help create a new paradigm for the university of the future. And with that said, I'd really like to thank Phil Pizzo, who started DCI. I'd like to thank Susan Golden, who is running something called DCIX, Susan Nash, who is my co-chair at DCI Rights, and Rebecca Trumbull, who is one of the many staff people who helped bring this about. And two people finally who, without their help, we would not be here, are Brittany Carlson and Roger Winkleman. They are our Zoom masters, masters of the universe. So I have the honor of introducing a very distinguished panel today. And I want to start with a quote by Dorothy Parker, who once said, "Creativity is a wild mind and a disciplined eye." It is my pleasure to introduce the wild mind of Tobias Wolff and the disciplined eye of Robert Pogue Harrison. Tobias Wolff's books include his two memoirs, This Boy's Life and In Pharaoh's Army. He also has 2 novels and 4 collections of stories, short stories to his credit. Now emeritus, he has the Woods Professor of English at Stanford, and in 2015 received the National Medal of Arts from President Barack Obama. Robert Pogue Harrison is a professor of literature at Stanford in the Italian and French departments. He is an acclaimed author, writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, and hosts a popular show entitled Opinions. He is also the lead guitarist for a rock band called Glass Wave, and in keeping with Tobias, received the Chevalier Order of Arts and Letters from the French government. We will also be joined by Elena Danielson, author of The Ethical Archivist. She is Director Emerita of the Hoover Library and Archives, and the wonderful Cynthia Haven, who is a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. She also has a blog, The Book Haven, and has just posted a Wall Street Journal article about the poet Robert Conquest and his poems of elegant irreverence. So without any more of me, I turn it over to the panel for the discussion of the Aspern Papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, and to DCI as well. So just let me say one or two words to all the people who have joined us here today. You know, when you go back to the Homeric epics, what you find is that the hero needs the poet to the same degree that the poet needs the hero. So without Homer, Achilles' honor is feckless. And of course, without Achilles and the other heroes, what were called heroes in those days, you know, the poet has nothing to sing about. And somewhere along the line in the modern era, I think that the poet becomes a hero in his or her own right, and then receives a lot of the reverence and sometimes worship. We'll get into that as we discuss this novella we're talking about. And I just wanted to say that we've gotten to the point now in our history where there's a complete disproportion between the supply and demand when it comes to literature. And more and more time goes on, more and more books there are to read, and that just grows exponentially, whereas the readers themselves actually are diminishing rather than increasing. I think the readers of serious literature. So I would like you all to think of yourselves as the new heroes of our age and of literature, because it's the readers who keep the whole thing alive and going in a way that if there is such a thing as the Elysian Fields, where all the dead, the shades of the dead poets and writers congregate, they are certainly cheering for all of you who you know, taken an hour and a half of your afternoon today to join this discussion of Henry James and the Aspern Papers. So with that, I'd like to call into our session, you know, Tobias Wolff. And Tobias, as I've said before to another look audiences, is a national treasure of ours, a literary treasure. And so before we talk about the Aspern Papers, Toby, I'm curious about your relation to Henry James. Henry James is one of the great, if not the best known American novelists. And you, of course, come from a very different kind of literary tradition. So I'm wondering if James has ever had an importance for you, any kind of influence on you, and do you enjoy reading him? Do you read him with profit and pleasure?
First of all, I want to just take up something that you said a moment ago about readers. I remember when I was young, taking a tour of Chartres Cathedral, and the stained glass windows on one side of the cathedral were vivid and alive. The others, though, as beautifully conceived and done, were a little duller. And the guide explained this, and they were pretty contemporaneous, the making and installation of those windows. The guide explained it as, well, those are the windows that get the light, and the light itself enlivens them. And what you said made me think of that in relation to literature, that it is the attention of readers is the light that keeps these words alive for us. And so I dearly love a reader, even one that isn't a reader of my books. I love readers. But as for Henry James, I started reading him in my 20s, and I found it pretty rough sledding, I have to admit. It wasn't the literature that I had learned to love when I was younger, but I came to love it deeply. Especially Portrait of a Lady is one of my very favorite novels. The Golden Bowl, The Ambassadors, And I had not read the Aspern Papers since those years, did not remember it well. It was really like reading the book for the first time for me. And I just found it a delight because of its, when you encounter in literature a character who will do anything to get what he wants, you are interested. Just what will he do? What will he not do? And we have met in this unnamed narrator, someone who really will, I mean, it's just kind of lucky those two ladies in that old palazzo survived his interest in those papers. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. But I loved there's a really dark humor at work in this novella. A humor that would be lost, obviously, on Miss Tita and Juliana, but for the reader, it's there. And it consists in that almost religiously obsessional quest that the narrator has embarked on here. And it's not an accident that he uses so much religious language. We'll talk, I'm sure, more about that as we go on, but talks about he's hanging high in the heaven of our literature, keeps referring to the letters and other things of his as sacred relics. At one point, Mrs. Prest makes light of Aspern, and the narrator doesn't defend him. He says, one doesn't defend one's God. And it is a kind of strange pilgrimage almost that this narrator's embarked on. And how can you not be carried along by that? It's a great kind of narrative movement that is created right at the beginning. And also, and we'll talk more about this, I don't want to go on at length, there are others of this, but it's also a novel of seduction. In the great tradition of the English novels, think of Clarissa, over so many volumes, Lovelace is plotting, laying siege to Clarissa, and think of Pamela. From the very beginning, our novels have been about seduction because we think a lot about that, and those novels were written by men. But in any case, there's so much to be said in that vein. The way those two traditions in our narrative literature merge in this, the religious quest, the seduction, and I'll hand it over to others now.
Well, no, I think you should go on because there's a lot there in the text itself to support what you're saying about the seductive language, which is also traditionally merges with martial, language of a siege and assailing and bombarding. In fact, at a certain point, I think I remember the narrator saying, "I am going to assault and bombard them with flowers." No?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's a telling word there when he meets Juliana, and he describes her as being impenetrable. I don't want to put too much weight on that word, but it is not an innocent word, and in the context, and especially when, as the novel is going toward its end, as we all know, his obsession really becomes criminal. It is, in fact, he is in her bedchamber. She is in her night clothes when there's just the aura of rape hanging around of that kind of theft of a person's privacy. At the end of the novel, it is there's a charge of a kind of perverse sexuality in that quest that is realized in that scene. I don't know. I was actually, all these years later, I'd forgotten that. I was kind of shocked by it when I hit that scene.
Well, certainly he crosses a threshold in the scene you're referring to into some kind of inner temple, and it's it's that place of intimacy that for her is sacred in terms of its boundaries.
Yeah.
And of course, in that inner sanctum are the papers and the letters of exchange. I personally am not so shocked by the boldness with which the narrator sets out to get those papers. I tell you one reason why I'm not, is because it seems to me that Juliana has a rather mistaken idea of what the Romantic poets, how they conceived of their personal, intimate, private emotions in this kind of generous, open publication of everything that has to do with their inner sentimentality and their personal feelings. And it's every time you read one of the great poems of especially the second generation romantics of Byron, Shelley, Keats, you are entering into that inner sanctum of the self, of the poet's self, and they just very promiscuously share it with the whole world in terms of their willingness to publish. I also wonder what you think, Toby, about this idea that I have, is that Jeffrey Aspern, if he were a real, poet dead, that I think he would be going absolutely bonkers in his grave at the idea that Juliana just doesn't get it, that those papers were not intended just for her, that they were intended for posterity. There's a long tradition of letter writing where the addressee of a letter is not the personal property. It was obviously, in cases of poets like that, hyper conscious of the fact that maybe every little scrap of things that they wrote and it would be like relics, and that he would have wanted her to share some of these so-called private, personal documents with the world at large. What do you think about that?
Well, I never thought of that. I should have. Hemingway, who of course declared he didn't want all these things published, left them in very publishable order in his chest. So I had not thought of that. I will say, though, that I like your point about the Romantic poets writing from the self in a way that was fresh and a little more and unusual in poetic tradition, but they did it on their terms. They let you know what they wanted you to know. It was done in a certain form, and as I say, on their terms. But yes, I take your point that there's an irony there, that she may be guarding what he did not want to be guarded. But they are hers, and they are connected to her privacy, and it is I think your point really complicates this struggle very interestingly. I hadn't really thought of it that way.
So, yeah. Toby, we got an email from one of with a question from AXA.
Oh, yes.
Send it to you. I think it relates directly
right here.
Do you have that? Because
I don't read it right now.
Okay.
This question is from Aksa Ijaz of McGill University. Could you please talk about the significance of the sacred in James' story? For both Juliana Bordereau and the narrator, Jeffrey Aspern is like a god, yet they worship him in very different ways. Juliana cherishes the memories of her past intimacy and guards them jealously, even from her niece. The narrator worships Aspern by writing about him and publishing everything he can about his life and poetry. Does James favor one side over another in the clash between the narrator and Juliana? What is the literary historian's moral responsibilities toward our dead subjects? Do historians transgress a sacred boundary when we delve into their private and personal lives? That is a very, very good question, of course. I'd love to hear what Elena thinks about that.
Yeah, Elena and Cynthia. But Elena,
Yeah, absolutely.
That question about are we violating something sacred as biographers? What do you?
That question is the central paradox of archives, which I worked with for decades. I was first told to read the Aspern Papers in 1984 by a man who had earlier in the 30s been the secretary to Leon Trotsky and had typed his correspondence, incoming and outgoing. And this man and I were going over Leon Trotsky's letters, including some love letters to his wife, Natasha. And so the question did come up, why did Boris Nikolaevsky save these letters at great risk to his life? Because there were, communist KGB-style guys going after him. Why did he save these letters? It was very dangerous. And the secretary said, all you have to do to understand this, collector, is read the Aspern Papers. So in 1984, I read the Aspern Papers, and I had done some collecting myself of literary correspondence, so Boris Pasternak papers and stuff. And I so identified with this unnamed narrator. He was saving our shared cultural literary heritage from a capricious old woman who probably had Alzheimer's or something, So he was my hero. And then after I retired and I was no longer hunting down papers, I read it again. And then I reacted more like you did, Toby. This guy's a criminal. He lies, cheats, and steals, and to some extent, he murders the old lady by pushing her over the edge. She's quite fragile. And he's almost willing to marry someone he despises. So he's a criminal. So what a horrible, horrible man he is. So my view of the privacy versus shared cultural heritage issue just changed totally. My perspective changed totally. And I've reread it again after studying ethics. After being an acting archivist, I studied the ethics to figure out what I had done right and what I had done wrong. And I found out there was no answer. So if you want to find the line between sharing our cultural heritage and our privacy, it's going to be a tension, it's going to be a conflict. And so I'm not a James scholar, I'm not a literary scholar, but I did look at a review James wrote a few years before writing the story. It was a review of some correspondence between two intellectuals, one a Dr. Channing and a woman named Lucy. And Channing, at the end of the correspondence, tells Lucy to either burn the papers or return them. And I believe that was a Victorian custom. At the end of your life, you take your treasured personal letters and read them one last time and burn. I believe Jane Stanford did that with her love letters from Leland, from when they were separated early in their marriage, and she burned them. She didn't want anyone eavesdropping on two tender young hearts, she said. But what did James say about this? Well, he said he was a little concerned that she kept these letters when he told her to burn them. And yet at the same time, James reads these letters and studies them and does a review of it. And he says, let's see, a man has certainly a right to determine, insofar as he can, what the world shall know of him and what it shall not. The world's natural curiosity to the contrary notwithstanding. So he comes out on the side of privacy, but he did read the letters. So he, I think, modulated the story because he tweaked it and played with it over and over. I think he was modulating the story so you could read it either way. He was that good a writer.
Yes. Yep. Sure.
That's my take.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. That's great. It still leaves a little bit in suspension whether a necessary violation takes place every time a historian or a biographer delves into the personal and private life of of a dead subject. And of course, when you do it with the religious zeal with which our narrator pursues his object, I think that's part of, that question is that there's two different ways of worshiping this Aspern. One is worshiping completely privately and jealously holding on to your own intimate connection with him. And the other is, and the other is completely doing him all this great service. The narrator believes he's doing a great service to Jeffrey Aspern by publishing biographies about him and rendering him more available to, to the larger public. So these are two different religions that are clashing, I think, one with another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Joyce
Definitely.
has a who obviously you'll see comes down on one side of this issue pretty strongly, has described literary biography as alchemy in reverse, taking the gold of a writer's work and turning it into the dross of their life, which is what their whole work is intended to transcend.
Exactly. In fact, there's
time for me to come in.
one quote that I will hear from Cynthia. I wrote it down somewhere here from Margaret Fuller, because I had to review a biography of Margaret Fuller, and she says something about, I can't read a biography. Every biography makes me feel sick. It makes one believe that there is no heaven to read the biography, precisely because of that reverse alchemy, where these writers spend so much time trying to distill, their spiritual life into some kind of quintessential goal, and later maybe we can say something about the role that gold plays in this novel, because it's she wants to be paid in gold, and it's also the color of Venice, according to anyway. But Cynthia, you've written many biographies. You're in the midst of writing one right now, and so you also know this from the inside. What's your take on it?
Well, I mean, you have to be able to live with yourself. I mean, that's not a literary point of view, but you have to be able to look yourself in the mirror. That said, if there's something negative out there, you have to be the expert on it. I mean, it's going to be out there. Someone else is going to find it. You have to frame it in a way that it's not reverse alchemy. And I think it can be done. But it's kind of, again, I have a background as a journalist as well as a biographer. And you have to chase down the rumors and then find a way of framing the story. And that's where the alchemy happens, one direction or the other. And I don't feel, I happen to write about people I admired. Fortunately, with Miłosz, who I'm writing about now, there was a very exhaustive biography that was done of him, 800 pages or something like that in Poland. Robert Frost said all the fun's in how you say a thing. And I think that's how you tell the story, to try to make these things felt. It's one thing to say, and I think that there's a lot of I think the nuggets are always exciting when you find something new. But there's all sorts of ways of making things come alive. It's one thing to say he mourned when his wife died. It's another thing, as I have done, to find letters that bring these things alive with the emotion that he was experiencing at the time. Is it a violation? I don't think so. But I think you have to be honest about what your motives are. Is that, I think that this is simply a matter of conscience that has to come into it.
Well, let me play devil's advocate, but with all due respect, because I don't believe it entirely. But one could say that let me just say, just hypothetically, that I prefer a rogue like our narrator to the the biographer who is so captivated by his or her subject and thinks that they're doing all this honor. It might be our narrator's problem as well, that they're that they're doing all this good by digging up every private emotion that was expressed in one letter or another, and mourning and grief. And this really is a question here about ownership. Who owns the written letter? Or I'm thinking about this. I don't know how many of you are aware that the T.S. Eliot correspondence with Emily Hale is a woman that he had been in love with, and he wrote some rather very personal letters that she donated to Princeton, the Princeton Library. And they have just now been made public because there was a 50-year moratorium after her death. And now these letters, which T.S. Eliot knew that she had given to this library and that they would be made available in 50 years, he wrote a number of things trying to belie what he actually said in those letters. I was never really in love with her. She didn't really understand my point. In other words, trying to warn posterity not to take those letters too literally. But in a certain sense, that raises the question, who does a letter belong to? If it belongs to the addressee, and yet there's your words and you're exchanging something very personal, then there's something rather perverse about that. I've written letters to people that if they donate, to a library, my letters to them, I will feel violated.
Yes, I've had it happen to me. I'm at Thematically archives at Yale, doing some research on Brodsky or Miłosz, and suddenly I see my name pop up. And somebody had donated my letters, and they were 20 years old, and I wondered what fresh idiocy I had written back then. Anybody can go look at them. Anybody can paw them. Anybody can get copies of them.
And this is something that I think, Toby, you're much more in risk than the rest of us of having these kind of snoops go through your papers and your letters and other things. What's your take on that?
That's a good question. Carol Sklenica, literary biographer who wrote Raymond Carver's biography. She just recently published the biography of Alice Adams. And when she was in the Carver archives, she found quite a few letters that I had written to Ray, and gave them to me. And I will say that many of these letters caused me a great deal of embarrassment. She happily did not find occasion to quote from them in her biography of Ray, but they're there, and my own papers are off somewhere in Indiana University. And I will admit that when they were descending on me to take these papers away, I was tempted to do a little sterilizing of the archive. But
don't you have every right to do that?
Well, yeah, I suppose you do. But I let my neck be stuck out there. And there were a couple of things that really would have been so hurtful to other people that I did. There was no reason for their letter to be in there or my letter to them to be in there. There just wasn't any reason for that. But writers tend to be, most of the writers that I have had continuous correspondence with, though that with emails pretty much gone now, but the ones that I have had have seemed, I can tell in the tone of their letters, been very conscious of readers yet unborn, if you will. And the phrasing, the tone, the kinds of things they'll touch on, and you can almost feel them preening over an idea that they've had that they're quite happy to have read again 50 years from now. So writers are not innocent. People who are, they know the deal in a way, and it's the collateral damage often that I think can be worrisome. People who swept up in a writer's world, not thinking about that kind of thing, and suddenly finding their own most important thoughts and feelings of a given time at risk of public discussion, exposure. So that's a different kind of question. I'm a little less sympathetic frankly, with the situation of the writer. I wasn't worried about Jeffrey Aspern in this story. I was worried about Juliana more and question of her privacy.
Just for the sake of our listeners who don't know, copyright law is you own the letter. If I write you a letter, you own the letter. But if you want to cite it, you have to get my permission.
Wait a minute, I have to get your permission to cite a letter that you wrote me?
Yes, this is correct. This is correct.
And this causes infinite hell for us because, we have the letter, but the physical object belongs to the recipient, but actually to cite from it, and I think the laws are slightly different and more strict for unpublished letters. But even if it's been published in the book, I need to get permission to some. Elena, you were talking about the customs of burning letters. That might be a good thing for people to know too.
Yes. So I think this whole idea of burning letters was kind of embedded in Victorian life when letters had a different role. And one of the things James talks about is he's now living in a technological world with telegrams that are open to, the telegraph operator reads your letter, and postcards were coming into vogue in the 1870s, and you could read them. But the old generation of letter writers, so this would be the Aspern, the first half of the 19th century, they had a very ritualistic way of dealing with letters, saving the correspondence. And my understanding is the etiquette was, at the end of your life, you either return the letters to the sender because they do own the words. Legally, copyright, the person who wrote the words owns the rights to them. You either return the letters or you destroy them. And that's what my mother did, so she's kind of Victorian. And she made me distribute people's letters back to them and made me promise not to read them because it was private and it wasn't my business. So I think that was kind of a Victorian culture that we lost with the more technological society where we have, in James' period, it was already starting with the telegraph and the postcards. And of course, in our era with Twitter and all of this, and email that can get forwarded anywhere, it's become a different world. But I did find a rule about this. Somebody named Hartley wrote something called the Go-Between.
Oh, L.P. Hartley. Great.
And he says, the rules about reading other people's letters are fairly well defined. I don't agree with him, but that's what he said. If you left your letters about and somebody read them, then it was your fault. And you were not justified in retaliation. If someone rifled your desk or locker and read them, then it was their fault and you were justified in taking vengeance. And vengeance is, of course, what Miss Tita takes.
And also, if a couple broke up, that was the standard thing to return the letters to the sender. That was the honorable thing to do.
That's right. Yeah.
So this all the whole Aspern letters thing is happening within that context. And now we've got tweets that can shape and define a life, and they're out there forever. And I'm a proponent for tweets' right to die.
Yes. One thing about the narrator not revealing his name that I found interesting, it's a little bit like Julian Assange was a firm believer everything should be open, right? Thousands of emails and he just dumps them on the internet. But his own emails were heavily encrypted and he got angry if people revealed them. So there is a real hypocrisy built into people's attitude toward their own privacy versus somebody else's privacy. And I think by not revealing his name, the narrator is trying to protect his privacy. And to make sure we notice this, James, who's such a superb writer, reveals his real name to Miss Tita, but not to the reader. So he's protecting his own privacy here, which I think is a hypocrisy kind of just sort of built into the human condition.
It's a comic note in this novella that he is so withholding of information. He who is always trying to unearth everyone else's. It's a delightful touch in the novel, I think.
Toby, can I ask follow up on that and ask you to think about, well, first this is going to be a general question. I believe that setting has a great determinative power over style. James, in 10 years after he published the first version of the Aspern Papers, wrote a preface. It's really, I don't like that preface one bit, but he goes into the background of how this story of Claire Clairmont, who was the lover of Byron and had a child by Byron, and who also probably was a lover of Shelley. Certainly she spent a lot of time with Shelley and Byron, and that she had lived into her to a great old age of 80, and she was in Florence just a few years before he descended there. And he said that there was this American captain, Silsby, who was a worshiper of Shelley, and he would give anything to have anything of object or letter, and that he moved into the little hotel, the pension that Claire Clairmont was staying in with her niece, and without subterfuge really kind of harassed them for a long time and did not succeed in getting Claire to turn over the documents. Went back to the States, she dies. He goes back to Florence, and then Juliana, the niece, says, yeah, okay, you can have the letters if you marry me. And the price was too high to pay. So James has the Aspern Papers is based on a kind of true story, if you like. And he says in his preface that in order to camouflage the factual basis of this story, I moved the scene from Florence to Venice. Yeah. As if that's an innocent sort of move. Now, I cannot believe that the Aspern Papers, the way we know them, could have been written if the city in question were Florence and not Venice.
It would be so different, wouldn't it? The whole, there's something beautifully used up about Venice. And I mean, even the Venice he describes is not so different from the Venice I experience when I go there. That sense of something moldering a bit, that very well past its glory. And you definitely can imagine such a person as Juliana and her niece living behind one of these crumbling facades. So no, the whole atmosphere of the story lends itself so perfectly to the story he's telling. Yes, and then Florence would be very different, brighter, louder. No, Venice was it was a brilliant choice to move it to that.
Yeah.
And as for the introduction, I mean, I found it interesting to get some sense of the genesis of the story, of the idea that, you know, the thing that prodded him to write it, or somehow galvanized his ideas for this story. And that's a wonderful example of dross being turned to gold. I mean, that story that he tells in his introduction to the Aspern Papers of the first origins of his ideas for this story, it's an interesting anecdote, but what he turned it into is just wonderful. And I sort of like to see what a writer does with you know, a little premise like that. Where do you go with it? And I think it's wonderful.
It also relates to what you were saying earlier, and then I'll give the word to you, Cynthia, in a moment. But when we were talking about and also what Elena was saying about the strategy of the narrator to withhold conceal his identity. Venice is not a neutral, well, so on the one hand, what you were saying, Toby, is exactly right. In a letter or an essay, I think James calls it the most beautiful of tombs. So there's something entombed there. There's also, it's the city of masks and facades, yes. And a carnival, obviously. And I'm glad that James doesn't make too much a big deal about the carnival. But nevertheless, there's this theatrical motif that is part of the game playing of the narrator on the one hand, but it's also Juliana, because she, keep in mind that she wears this green shade, and conceals her face even from her niece, we're told in many occasions. And there's that one moment of revelation towards the end, the climactic moment, when he sees her extraordinary eyes, as he calls them. But she is playing a game with him as much as he's playing a game with her behind appearances that are misleading. And I noted a few of the references to theater in the book, where he says the splendid common domicile, familiar, domestic, and resonant, also resembles a theater. Speaking about Venice here, with actors clicking over bridges and in straggling processions tripping along fundaments. As you sit in your gondola, the footways and in certain parts edge the canals assume to the eye the importance of a stage, meeting it at the same angle, and the Venetian figures moving to and fro against the battered scenery of their little houses of comedy strike you as members of an endless dramatic troupe. So you have this notion that we're in a stage. The city is that kind of stage. And by the way, when he does get into the inner sanctum of the private chambers, what does he say? He says, the room was a dire confusion. It looked like the room of an old actress. Mm-hmm. So that notion of the mask and of dissimulation, something, it really is part of the DNA of this city, known for the commedia dell'arte, which is a kind of form of theater where you just have stock masks, and also of the carnivals of Venice and so forth.
Venice is also famous for stolen treasures. You know, the Venetians raided treasures and displayed them. So they took cultural treasures and made it their own. And that's what the narrator is trying to do.
Exactly.
And religious treasures. St. Mark's, right, is built around stolen relics of St. Mark. Right. I mean, you know, it's talking about relics here.
May I ask a question, Toby? You mentioned that preface, and I was struck when I read it. I was a little bit shocked, actually, on how close Miss Tita is based on this other woman. It seemed to me that the novel violates her privacy as much as any journalist or biographer could. I just felt for this poor woman who had this private humiliation. And now it's been immortalized. I'm not sure she'd be consoled by the idea that her humiliation has been made public to millions in the name of great literature. And it strikes me that novels can be, violate people's privacy as much without the guardrails. I mean, if you're a biographer, you actually have to stick to some facts. You can be taken to the cleaners if you wholly make up something or you misquote something. And yet we've got a whole genre of people in novels getting back at their ex-husbands or whatever, thinly veiled novels. How does that fit into the picture?
Well, you know, that's a good point. I think that he would have been fine if he hadn't made the connection himself in the introduction.
Exactly.
You know, no one would have thought her otherwise, I think. But I don't know what he did.
Well, what do you say, Toby? Should we take some questions? We might have a few questions. Donna, do we have anyone who was sent in any questions?
We have many, many, many questions, actually. And I forgot to say at the beginning of the Zoom how to work it, but it seems like everybody has figured it out. But just in case, Q&A at the bottom of your screen, you just click on that and a panel shows up and you can write a question to the group, and Brittany or myself can look at them. We also had a few questions before the Zoom session started. So I think I want to ask those. Dan Carpenter was the first person to actually submit a question. His question: I'm curious whether the panelists or others were disappointed that James didn't try his hand at fabricating Aspern's poetry. Thoughts? Anyone?
Oh, yeah, I thought about that, definitely. I'm sure we all did. I think it was absolutely the right decision. Because it doesn't matter what happens if he starts putting Aspern's poetry up is that when we start judging the poetry and whether Aspern is worthy of this adoration or not, which is entirely beside the point with adoration. Adoration is like grace. It doesn't necessarily have a cause. So the point is that for him, this is a God. And it isn't for us to say that he isn't. I think it was absolutely the right thing for him to just proceed on the assumption that he was worth his adoration.
Great.
Yeah, well, I have, a good friend of mine, Susan Stewart, who's a poet and literary critic, is well known to you, Toby. With her permission, she's not here for me to request the permission, but she wrote something quite interesting about that she became very interested in the deracinated American aspect of the story, because the English people have now become Americans, and but she points out that there was no American lyric poet of any stature at the end of the 18th or early 19th century. And in the 18 and 20s, no American was writing passionate love lyrics or even lyrics of subjective experience of the quality that, and even kind of second generation of British romantics or Europeans, including Leopardi. And that, and for Susan Stewart, it bothered her that there was no actual indication of the poems, no quotations or no passages, because it is a void where we don't hear the voice of that poet. And for Henry James to have supplied them or invented them or fabricated them, as the person asking the question, would have meant to intervene in literary history and become, at least briefly, the poet that America never had in that generation.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It runs a risk, though, for him to do that, because James does not want us to find his narrator's quest ridiculous. And there is such we can find it, all kinds of things, but I don't find it ridiculous. And I would, if the poetry were quoted, and I didn't think it was that great. What, all this for this poem? I don't think he had enough to gain to do that. But I love that idea of the fictional Aspern filling a void in American literature. It's a great idea.
Donna, any more questions?
Tons.
Okay.
And I apologize to everyone that we're not going to be able to get to all of these questions. But thank you for all of them. There are still several questions coming in asking specifically about what will happen with the digital records now. And how do you see, and this is kind of for the panel in general, all of you, how do you see digital correspondences affecting future literary works and people? I mean, how does it work? So that's for all of you.
Well, I think it's game over for literary archivists where letters are concerned. It's almost an affectation now for writer friends of mine to write me a letter, even typed, and a real letter. And sometimes if I lose someone close to me, or if a friend does, then I will write a handwritten or a typed note. But in God's own truth, all the writers I know write emails now, and emails by their very nature tend to be very businesslike. I'll meet you there at noon. Sometimes even without saying "Dear Toby," and And that has got to be, I mean, what I love, for example, Byron's letters are one of the treasures on my bookshelf. I just love those letters so much. And there's not going to be a book like that coming from this time. I really don't think there is. What do you think?
Ever have your hard drive crash? I think we have a great faith in the cloud, but a research librarian told me we trust in the cloud, but nothing is more ephemeral than the cloud. I think we're in for some surprises with the imperishability of digital records. We're still beginning. I already have videos I took to record people, digital recordings that now can't be retrieved because they're 5 years old and the technology has changed, or 10 years old. There's a lot of things just disappearing. There's nothing as imperishable, and it's very perishable as paper. The Library of Congress is our closest idea to eternity.
Well, yeah, so but maybe we take another question what do you think, Don?
Sure, that's fine. I actually have a question from Sandra Harrison. The Library of America has published 5 volumes of Henry James's complete stories. There are so many of them. Why did Robert and Tobias choose the Aspern Papers for another look? Were there other stories considered? Ooh.
Well, we did consider The Turn of the Screw, but I guess I was the one who proposed to you, Toby, maybe we'll take a look at the Aspern Papers. Might be a good choice for this particular special session of Another Look, because we weren't supposed to have a session here in August, and it was opening up to the Distinguished Careers Institute members, and we thought that, I think we came to the conclusion that this particular story of Henry James was more plot driven than many of his other stories, and therefore could hold the interest of readers who want from a novel that kind of dynamism. But frankly, one of the main reasons I thought it would be an appropriate book to read is because it has much to do with what we've been talking about, even the digital age, but even more than the digital, the social media age. And this idea of, I just cannot get outraged and indignant at this narrator who is violating, this myth of the difference between the public and the private. If any game is over, Toby, I think it's the game that there is some kind of sanctity to the private when we live in a world where people just obscenely put out on Facebook and other media, everything that has to do with their so-called personal lives. In fact, they can't get enough public attention for the most petty private aspects of their, of their lives. And that this novel, I thought, had some pertinence to the kind of momentous cultural shifts that have been taking place through the digital social media that we're dealing with. I mean, what is a self after all? Is there anything truly, genuinely, without bad faith, is there anything truly like privacy left in our world?
One of the things
the computer guys, yeah.
Go ahead, Elena.
Yeah,
these computer guys that built the internet, Vince Cerf and all these guys, they just said, there is no privacy. Get over it. Yeah. But these are the same guys that don't want you reading their email. So Stanford is turning itself inside out with encryption and 2-step authentication. And I mean, just trying to get to the library catalog, I have to enter all of these codes. And, for my emergency kit for the fires, I had a code book with all my pins and my passcodes and my ID names and all of that stuff, because without that, I'm gone. I'm toast, so to speak.
I didn't think of that. I got to stick that stuff in my bag too. But I went back to you, Elena, this whole digital thing as an archivist. I mean, you must have seen like letters such as used to exist kind of drying up. I mean, the whole the things you look for as an archivist, as a deep resource on some subject. This must present real challenges now, huh?
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. And there are coping mechanisms, there's the Wayback Machine, and there are all kinds of digital databases. So the archivist actually went digital kind of on the leading edge. We were early adopters, believe it. Everyone thinks of it as kind of stuffy and old-fashioned, but archivists were really early adopters, and we did RLG here at Stanford was in the forefront of digitizing library materials, and there are incredible databases. So the tension between, too much information and then, as Cynthia is saying, losing information, it's another one of these archival paradoxes, of which there's a lot. And it is not easy to solve. But the thing that I find so interesting is that with all, especially right now, because there's something called the Hathi Trust, which digitizes all of these books. And during the coronavirus, they're giving you free access. These are things covered with copyright, but because you can't go to the library, we have this window. We can go in and get access to stuff really fast. And so I found all kinds of quotes on, I can read you a whole stack of them. I found all kinds of quotes on letters and things that I couldn't have found if I were not under quarantine, living with my computer. So it's a tension between too much information being lost because of crashed hard drives and stuff and accidents like that. So there is this tension. But when it works, the interconnections, I think, are revolutionizing literary studies. The thing I find negative in all of this is that something Henry James talks about is that with the advent of the telegraph, where you had to pay per word, people came up with a special abbreviated, truncated language so they could send their message cheaply. And he said that corrupted the English language. That corrupted the beauty of our language. Whereas if you had written it out by hand, you would have had these rounded sentences, and now it's just bam, bam, bam. And I do find that the literary emails are not as graceful as the letters. And they sometimes have a certain charm, a spontaneous charm, but they lack the fluidity. And, when you are an archivist, I used to read the letters of Frida Kahlo. Her letters were glorious and very extravagant and beautiful, and she would draw little cartoons on them. When she was unhappy, she drew a little portrait of herself with one eyebrow crying an ocean and having an ocean liner sailing on it. So the little marginal sketches and the little whimsy and stuff, we try to introduce that with emojis, but the quality is not as graceful. And so we've definitely, and James he was really prescient. He saw us losing that. And I think it's just accelerated since then. And like Cynthia says, we're up against kind of a crisis. We either cope with this or we kind of lose something very culturally important. So
I would have to say that not everyone can write or should write like James. I don't think Tobias Wolff's style might not have been possible if the telegraph didn't exist, namely a kind of literature that is minimalistic and essentialistic and that eschews all the long, fluid, elegant, endless phrasings of a Jamesian style. So you can say that even literary modernism in many ways, I think of Samuel Beckett and others, that somehow the times have changed and literature changes with it, or sometimes even literature is ahead, is the vanguard of the technologies. If I read Emily Dickinson, a poem by Emily Dickinson is as telegraphic as I can imagine even much more quintessentially telegraphic and enigmatic. So it's a big topic.
Robert,
Yeah.
one thing you were talking about, the lack of a private self. You're not on the social media much, and I am. It's part of what I have to do. There's this cultivation of a fake public self.
Yes.
That you appear to be giving yourself, but you're holding a lot back. There are people that go on Facebook and talk about the last time they had sex or what they had for dinner, but there's a lot of us that have a very firm boundary of what we will appear to be giving while cultivating a private self. And Elena, you might know about this, but I know that there is a legal definition of a public self versus a private self. Some of us are very careful to try to not cross that line, but it's very mushy, where you don't have the right to claim privacy law if you pass a certain threshold. You would know where that is.
And actually, you only know when there's a lawsuit. So if you make yourself into a public figure, you're fair game for gossip and revelations and all of that. If you do not put yourself into the public sphere, you have a stronger case to make for privacy. The privacy laws in the United States go back to Brandeis when photography became common in newspapers, and people started suing newspapers because their photographs appeared and they weren't flattering. And so it was photography that was the first technological innovation that brought privacy into the courtroom. And it was Brandeis who said, yeah, if you're a private individual, you have more protection. But if you're the president of the United States or something like that, they can publish all the photos of you they want. So this is a relatively new principle in American life, the protecting privacy of people who aren't public figures.
Protecting to a certain extent, I would say, Elena, because frankly, I don't have a Facebook account, never have, and friends have posted photos of me when I was 16 years old or things. What right do people have to post to the whole world pictures of you that were, well, I guess legally they have that right, but I don't know. We might need what's that?
You could contest it, yeah. I
could contest it, yeah.
More, yeah, but you don't find out until a judge decides. And James did comment on photographs. Like with Aspirin, there were 3 portrait paintings of him, but no photographs. And so the photograph, not the photograph, but the little miniature painting,
yeah,
plays a very interesting role at the end. Yeah.
It does.
You have a right to your image. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's strange how that portrait actually never escapes the circuit of economy. Whether she's asking for £1,000, poor Tita intends it as a gift, but the narrator feels so guilty that he feels like he has to put a pecuniary value to it and sends her, we have to imagine maybe £300 rather than 1,000, or the best he can do. But yeah, Donna, we better move on, because if we have that many questions, we have to. Go ahead, Toby.
You have to note that the narrator, after he sends her that, notes, I think a little ruefully, after he sends her the money, she did not send it back.
That's right.
I love this narrator.
He was expecting her to. Yeah.
It's his last lie. He tells her that he sold it and he's actually kept it.
Right.
Goes out with a lie.
Yeah, it was. But, I think Tita is much less innocent than he assumes her to be. And I seriously doubt she just burned those letters. I have no doubt in my mind that she held on to them because she knows the value of them, and that she told him that she burned them really to get revenge for his having essentially humiliated her.
Yeah, I think you're right.
There were several questions asking about, do you think she really burned the letters? Okay, thank you. There's a Hilton Obenzinger, and I think I got that right, his question is, in all of the attempts to get the papers and the money that's exchanged, paying rent, it's intriguing that marriage is the one more exchange, but the narrator is one more exchange, but the narrator, after all that he's done, finds that it is too much. Is this a limit to the commodity exchange? Considering the narrator's aggression, this is a step too far, but it's what the niece uses. What do you think of this dynamic? So the dynamic essentially between the marriage, paying rent, all the money, and the final straw, and he said no.
It shows, I think, that he falls short in his service to his God. He is not really in all the way.
Well, I also believe that he mismanages the situation horribly at the end there, because Hilton's question is an excellent one. It's the idea that Tita is it's a contract. Marriage has more often than not, been a kind of contract, and this for that. And yet, I think the narrator too hastily assumed that what Tita wanted in that moment was a husband, rather than a counselor, an ally, a friend, someone who could help her navigate now this new situation that she finds herself in, where she needs legal advice, she needs economic thing. And I think had he managed it differently by saying, look, marriage is not in my life plans. However, I'll be there for you, be a friend. I can get you to the right lawyers and things like that. I think that had he been more patient and had he been less paranoid about the offer, less horrified, frankly, that she would have eventually at least let him read the papers and probably publish them. But he screwed that one up, I think. Another one, Donna?
Yeah. This
Running
is
out of time here. Yeah.
No. What, about 5 more minutes or so? Or
yeah, about 5 or 10.
Okay. So this is from Brindy Beach. Should we believe that James intends the reader to believe that Aspirin is a god, or that the letters might in fact reveal something very controversial about the poet himself, rather than something compromising regarding Juliana? That's a good one.
Well, definitely, there's a suggestion that what he mentions that the rumor had been circulating that Juliana had a foreign lover before she met Aspern, and that the letters, that there might be that, in other words, he was looking maybe for a scandalous kind of scoop that he could. But when it's interesting, if the question is about whether he was hoping to find something equally attention-grabbing in the life of Jeffrey Aspern, because that would make it. You see, what bothers many of us is that his interest, his worship of Aspern borders on not just the sacrilegious, but the tabloid. We don't know what line he would draw before descending into, the kind of vulgarity of tabloid journalism.
And he does. I think that's a good point. And there's a passage in the novel where he is meditating on Juliana's origins, her painter father who goes to Europe to learn the old school, and then he begins to have rather salacious imaginings about Juliana. And he has no information to base this on at all. It is, right. He's writing a kind of fiction about her that no doubt makes the letters even more enticing for him. So I think that's a really interesting reading, that it's a kind of tabloid imagination there at work that charges his search again.
Right.
In his review of this correspondence with a Dr. Channing, he says that the publication of the correspondence is a rather striking concession to the pestilent modern fashion of publicity. So publicity is a negative word for him.
Well, think of Juliana's ultimate curse of the narrator. You publishing scoundrel. Publishing, that is the elderly condemning adjective she could use.
Yeah, and I'm convinced there's an allusion there to an Emily Dickinson poem.
Yes.
Publication is the auction of the mind of man.
Wow.
Poverty be justifying for so foul a thing, possibly. But we would rather from our garret go white unto the white creator than invest our snow in publication.
Oh, that is wonderful. Where is that? Is that 11?
It's a poem called Publication is the Auction of the Mind of Man. It's that you sell it off cheaply. And it goes with the economic pecuniary imagery throughout this book about what are those papers worth. And Hilton's question, do you get to the limit and all of a sudden, yeah, the price is too high to pay.
Yeah.
And it is too high. Silsby, the original captain, he also thought it was too high a price. And yes, anytime you're in that circuit of economic exchange, there is always a price that could be too high to pay.
Well, this kind of goes to another question. Wallace Leslie put this one in. Is it kind of hard for you literary worthies to consider whether it is appropriate to worship any writer to the extent that a crusade to recover his or her artifacts excuses any means taken? Maybe that's for the...
I cannot understand that kind of hero worship. I find that people who live vicariously in the lives of others, it's just something. I was too nourished on existentialism, and I remain an existentialist. And there's something about the inauthenticity of this kind of self-projection into a hero that you turn into a god, no matter how great a writer. I mean, there are a lot of prices I would not pay to get closer to Shakespeare. I mean, I would give anything to be able to meet him if I could, but it's an obsession that's alien to me. I don't know about you, Toby. Yeah. Do you have fans that
I do.
Have you ever had fans that obsess about you?
Now and then, in an odd way, there's an ending line in one of my stories that apparently people have had tattooed on them. I mean, I'm grateful for their interest, but it seems a little odd sometimes. I read literary biography from time to time, I tend not to be so interested in our near contemporaries. I like reading literary biography, generally speaking, of the last century and farther back. And I know that my pleasure in these biographies, when I read it, has come at the expense of someone who has, in a sense, handed their life over to someone else for out of this great care. And it isn't something that I have in me. But I'm grateful for the products of it.
For sure. Well, Donna, maybe we have time for one more brief question.
I'm going to send you an out there one. This is from Daniel Roebuck. Many of James's stories include the supernatural, including ghosts. In a way, the Aspern paper represents a ghost as well. How is James using the supernatural thematically in the Aspern papers? There you go.
Well, I think it's a great question. What do you think, Toby? I think it is, in many ways, you could call it a ghost story, because Aspern, clearly the ghost of Aspern is everywhere. Juliana herself seems to be a ghostly kind of survivor. She's a relic. She is a relic herself in a ghostly way. And but I don't think he crosses any line from the natural to the supernatural in this story that I know of.
There is certainly an element of horror, I think, to the story. That scene in the bedroom it's a horrific charge, that scene. But no, it isn't like The Turn of the Screw, where he's really using the notion of the supernatural to vitalize the narrative. But I really admire the narrative velocity and drive of this particular story. It's not a meandering path that it takes like so many of his works. It is very purposeful right from the beginning, on the narrator's part and on the writer's part. It's very, very. I really came to love this when I reread it, I have to say.
Yeah, I did too. And I'll say just one quick thing about the supernatural. If there is that moment, it's at the climactic moment where we finally see her eyes, and they are burning, they are fiery, and we never see into her, even when she unveils her eyes. But it's almost supernatural to me when she says, "You publishing scoundrel." Those eyes are looking right into us. He has penetrated the inner chambers, but she is penetrating right into our most vulgar of ages, where the obscene dominates over discretion in every kind of sphere, and not even, into the 20th century, even into our 21st century. That seems like an almost supernatural message to our contemporaneity to me.
Kind of like a collapse of the fourth wall in a novel.
Right. That's nicely put.
A wonderful point.
There is one last question. It's come in from a few different people. They want to know what line Tobias Wolff fans have tattooed on their bodies. just you brought it up. I'm just the messenger. Don't you?
Where, given that we live in this age, where is it tattooed?
A couple of people have sent me pictures of this one tattooed on there. It's the last line of a story called Bullet in the Brain, and the line is, they is. And I love that they did it.
Well, listen, as moderator here, and then I'll give the last word to Donna. I want to thank all of you who have stayed. I can't believe that we remained above 200 participants up till the end of this hour and a half. That's great. We hope you enjoyed it. Thanks to Cynthia Haven, as always, for keeping the Another Look, going strong. And Elena, thank you. You brought a really essential kind of voice to this discussion. And DCI and Roger Winkleman. We couldn't do it without Roger. And Donna, you especially, special thanks to you and getting DCI involved in that. So.
Thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
It's great.
So should we just leave it at that? Yeah, good. Well, you guys have a nice week, and hopefully there'll be another future installment of Another Look somewhere down the line.
All right. Bye, all. Thank you.
Bye.